Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today I'm joined by John Dorsey of the Superhuman Public Radio podcast, one of my absolute favorites. We've had him and Max Clark on before as guests, and we did a lot of work together actually on season 2. I was someone who talked to them a little bit about some of the great issues they explored. We had them on already to talk about season 2 as a whole, but today we wanted to get back together to talk about issues of disability and representation, and how these stories get told, especially when you're telling them as people who aren't necessarily part of the groups that you're talking about. So, John, hello and welcome.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. I'll say for those who are watching on video, I'm still working on my laptop. Apologies. Hopefully by the next time we record, I'll be back on my desktop, just having some computer trouble. Also, Maximilian Clark may be joining us later, but John and I will certainly have a lot to talk about. So, John, first of all, just for those who maybe haven't heard you before, haven't checked it out, what is Superhuman Public Radio?
Yeah, so Superhuman Public Radio, or as we like to call it in show, SPR, is a parody of NPR in a world of where superheroes are central to American politics and life.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're fans of shows like Welcome to Night Vale, or hell, I should have all of these in front of me when I'm talking about the show.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fun comedy program, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I remember the first time I had you on, I accidentally titled the show Superhero Public Radio, and you all corrected me that it's Superhuman Public Radio. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's one of the most interesting things is, as you said, there definitely are heroes, there definitely are villains, but a lot of it's just about the fact that we just have a lot of people who are superpowered in this world.
Yeah, well, it's me and Max when we were developing the show, and we knew the initial pitch on the show was a superhero themed NPR.
Right.
And we had a lot of discussions about where that would come from and what the show would look like, and we made the active choice to make it superhuman, because not every episode is going to deal with superhumans or with superheroes. Like,
right.
People may have superpowers, but they might be an accountant or just a firefighter, right? Like they're not Spider-Man, they're not Superman. And it was a way to make our world a lot bigger and allow us to tackle not only superhero stories, but then, what is the guy who catches on fire, but, work in a secondhand store? Like, what is his life like?
Yeah. Every time I watch these shows and movies about superheroes and supervillains, that is one thing that we start talking about, especially because now, as you and I were talking about off air, we are really quite saturated with those kind of stories. It's fun to get into questions like, what is life insurance and property insurance like in places where all the stuff is happening? And I love how your show really is exploring that. It's, you are telling a narrative, and the narrative is quite interesting and certainly takes some twists and turns. I'm not necessarily going to spoil here, but I think that alone makes the show worth checking out. But you just guys do so much of that world building of exploring these questions of, okay, in a world where all these people have powers, but not everyone, how is that going to change daily life?
Yeah, and it's really what you're talking about of you're watching something and those questions pop up. That's the show. It was our way to deal with that. Especially as I get older. Before we hopped on, we were just kind of talking about being older nerds and kind of having a little bit of chagrin about where superhero media and a lot of nerd media are these days. The things that I'm attracted to are the stories that deal with superheroes and genre elements, but then are outside of the hero's journey. They're outside of the tales of heroism and are not necessarily and are stories of normal life
Right.
through a fantastic lens.
Right. And I think, like many of the best of the superhero comics and superhero TV shows and movies, you guys also certainly are writing a lot of things where if you look a little bit between the lines, or sometimes don't even have to look that far, the parallels to, like, you're making commentary about our own world and dynamics in our own world, that are like, in the same way that Captain America punching Hitler was.
Yeah. Well, and being based on, the show isn't a one-to-one parody. Max, who is our series director and also co-writer, and is joining us right now, will let you know that we don't try to do one-to-one parodies of anything, but
Right.
and Max hates parodies, but he
That's fair. That's fair.
but that's part of the show.
I hate
is
parodies.
that
Hate them.
It's okay if we're gonna make fun of this
sorry.
thing.
I love
It's not
satire
enough
and-
to make
and
fun
I-
of it.
I
It's
love
why are we
parodies.
making fun of it?
I hate making parodies.
Why is this funny? Why is this weird? Why is this scary or whatever? We try to take it a step further.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. For me, the only reason I don't like working in parody is I find it limiting. Like
Mhm.
when you're doing a parody, you have to get a lot of things right about it, and you can't have real characters. Like Frank Drebin only has so much agency.
It's a send-up, yeah.
He's the protagonist in The Naked Gun because he's the classic hard-boiled detective, and like there's only so much movement, so he doesn't get to be a complete character, which works because
People.
it's like,
Yeah,
it's-
like, I mean, I don't think that you're doing
comedy.
parody by
Right,
any
exactly.
means.
But
To me, it feels
in
like
what
it's
we're
much
doing,
more
we,
in the kind of science
wanted to skirt
fiction,
that line between comedy and drama,
speculative
and
fiction
that means we have to have real
realm
characters, which
of
means they have
let's
to be
take a problem in our own
unique.
world
Yeah.
and place it in this very different kind of world, maybe to offer some answers, maybe just to say, how does this change your feelings on the question by looking at it in a new way? And that's not about parody. That's just about how can we tell an interesting story that is about people fundamentally different to the audience, but still has enough of the audience to relate to and say, oh, okay, I don't have the superpower, but I understand the problem that guy has. Yeah.
We're pretty reference happy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, exactly. Well said.
So, Max, you jumped in a little
And
bit late.
we do a lot
wanna
of
give
references.
a quick introduction
references
to the audience?
Great. You do a lot. Yeah. You get a lot of mileage out of a good reference. Oh yeah, absolutely. Hi everyone. I'm Maximilian Clark. On SPR, I am the director and editor, sound designer, and co-writer. A lot of hats, and otherwise, I do a lot of directing and writing for various things. I'm also a producer.
You're there to
Political
observe
Troll,
and
Walter
and,
Masterson,
and comment on from the other perspective.
Spend a lot of
just
my
to be
time
clear.
in
Okay.
QAnon and Trump rallies. Yes.
I don't think any of my audience.
Yes,
would think
I'm
that
not
I
there
would bring
because
on
I
a
think that Joe
QAnoner,
Biden
but
is a
just
lizard
wanted to make
person
that
being
exceptionally
remote
clear
controlled
for folks.
by Obama from his
Now,
basement,
I
which
do-
is a real thing. Someone has told me.
Now, I do want to get into the specific topics for today, but I do have to ask first.
Yeah.
For an audio
always good
drama
to clarify
podcast,
why we were
what does a
at
set
36.
designer do?
A set designer?
I thought you said you were a set designer as part of what you did for. Oh, okay, that makes much more sense. You understand?
Yeah, honestly,
designer?
truly,
What do you mean?
yeah.
Sound designer. Well, actually, you know what? Kind of the same thing, right? When you think about it, right? Because one of the big things in sound design is trying to feel like, okay,
Yeah, you're
in this
giving the
space,
audience the
what
clues they need
exists
to
along with
kind
our
of create the
character,
image in their
and
head.
how are they
Okay,
moving through
yeah,
the
there we
space?
go.
So, in some
There we
ways,
go.
like,
So we now
the
we just need to know what
specific bird
categories to
call
nominate you for. So
is part
I
of
want
our
to
set.
understand it properly. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, saved it.
There we go. There we go.
Well,
So
I
let's
will
talk about
absolutely win it.
because we've had you on a bunch of times
I'd be happy
before,
to accept an
including
award
to
for
talk
set
about
design.
season
I'd probably be
2.
the only one nominated.
But I know that
and I think that gives
as
me a good
part of the
chance.
writing process of season 2, you guys reached out to a lot of folks, myself included, to kind of help with you with some perspectives that aren't necessarily your own. And we'll talk specifically about the disability question. But first, I'd just love to hear from you guys. What was that writing process like? Like, what was the process of you guys deciding, like, we need more voices in this room?
Well, I mean, I think our format really lends itself to bring in more perspectives. Like, we always want our show to feel big, and there's a limiting factor with Jack and I being a couple of white dudes behind it. And we brought on 4 or 5 writers this year, and I think that we're intending to bring on even more next year for the same reason. Just like, stories are sort of born of your own perspective in life, and
also,
to give yourself that
it's just
variety.
My favorite
really like make a world feel complete.
Piece of writing out of season 2 came out of another writer
from other folks,
and her pitch on what was a fairly boilerplate idea was so awesome. And then the Devin Connolly one, and that was just purely out of, as Max was saying, like
just Devin,
a different pot. Different pots make different batches of soup.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I should be better at metaphors if I'm a writer. You have a chicken noodle soup pot, and
I was going to let the culinary part go and just accept it as a metaphor. So
yeah, no, because everyone who's made soup knows that you have different pots every time you make a different kind of soup. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think if you're glot kosher, you can relate. But no, absolutely. I mean, like, again, it's about creating layers, and obviously we had a pretty strong hand in just making sure that everything felt tonally correct for the show. But outside of that, I think that's something that we actually really want to do even more next season, is allow people to really like come at us with unexpected pitches within our framework, and just get those voices out there. Because there's like, for a while it was like very hip in like studios to say, write what you know. I think there was like a 4 or 5 year period where every meeting I ever had on any level with executives was always like, and why are you the person to tell this story? And I think that is,
and I know I've heard a lot of people from
underrepresented
communities say that
correctly.
That one of the results of that can be that they're expected to only write the stories of that community, especially the ones that people expect. For anyone who's seen American fiction, it's a great sort of discussion at this point.
Yes. Yeah. Right. There's all these like stay in your lane comments, and a great writer can write about anything, but they can't do it in their head. I think that's where it was born from, the idea of like, you can't just imagine what life would be like for a homeless person and then write a first person story about a homeless person. It's going to fall flat. It's not going to feel real. So it's about doing the research and having conversations with people in that community, bringing their voices in, their opinions, like really like testing out like your story and the voices in order to make it feel real. And I think that's
I'm a big believer of pendulums. I think will swing a little bit too far one way, and then we'll overcorrect, and eventually kind of find a balance, and then the next thing will swing too far one way, and etc.
Yeah, exactly. But the upside, I mean, this is why we we had a segment involving disability, and so we wanted to reach out to people with disabilities, and just like because you don't want to be bad at your job. Essentially, I was going to say you want to be sensitive, but no, it's not even about that. It's you don't want to do a bad job.
You have
and
to,
if your goal is to portray a sort of character, and you do it poorly,
to people from different communities,
right?
Just about the stuff you're writing. And simple. It really is. It's just you have to check.
Well, especially because, and I want to hear more about that process, especially because I just to be clear, I was one of the people that you all reached out to about disability, and so I want to talk about that specifically. But just even on this in more general terms, one of the things I think that happens way too easily is people get in a cycle of thinking, oh, I've watched 8 million movies about people from this community, so I know that community well enough to write it myself, without realizing that that means that once the sort of stereotype gets established in the media, then it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, every story I've seen about Black people has them speaking this way and, dealing drugs or doing whatever terrible thing. So therefore I know that experience and I can write that kind of a story. And
Right. Yeah. It's the idea that I have seen some white guy in the 70s write this story about Black
tell
people.
me more about, you talked
I
about
think I know Black
bringing
people
writers in, but then also you guys did this research of reaching out.
Yeah, that's
I know when you guys first contacted me about it, one thing you said is that it was something you'd want to talk more about on the podcast. Talk a little more about that process, and was disability the only issue that you kind of reached out to, and just how did that whole conversation get started?
So the segment that you consulted on was one of my pitches, and it was going to be about an individual who had the same powers as Multiple Man and wound up being in charge of essentially the 911 program for the superhero
Who is Multiple
community.
Man, just for those who aren't as knowledgeable?
Oh, and Multiple Man is my favorite mutant and has the ability to duplicate himself, and all sorts of shenanigans follow that. And in our world, Ellen, it was Ellen. I should know this character's name. Gladys.
Right.
I'm sorry. So Gladys was this character's name. Has like a psychic connection to all these people.
Gladys.
And one of the ways that
you're thinking Ellen Spiegel,
just bare face, mile high pitch, was to make this person wheelchair bound. Of just like, why is this person being put into this amazing position? If their power is so powerful, if they're so powerful, why are they doing this? And it's just, they're confined to a chair. And while I wrote something that I was proud of, is just having known you, of just, well, I should talk to somebody about this.
Right.
And it just purely comes from that. A lot of the stories that I tend to write on the show, I know Max is the same. If we write something that deals with a particular type of community, or just even somebody who has a similar job or the job of who we're writing, we'll tend to reach out to those people and say, hey, is this real?
Right.
Because even if it sounds true, like you were saying, we've watched so much media, we're like, this is gospel truth, but really it's just a story we've been told. We need to hear the truth from the people who have lived it.
Right.
That's another that easy.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, like, again, us being a couple of white guys, we don't want to just tell stories about white guys, like, essentially, right? We're bored by them. Like, Indiana Jones was great, perfect, had a wonderful time, but we don't want to just talk about like white college professors, and so because we want to tell these stories, we don't always have. I mean, we want to tell stories about every community. We don't necessarily always have writers from every community.
Doing our best.
And so,
and I think that's what a lot of it's about. And in that same spirit, I want to offer a bit of consulting.
Do the work.
Terms like wheelchair bound or confined to wheelchairs are ones that a lot of the community are kind of moving away from. We tend to more like to say that, someone's a wheelchair user, just in terms of because they do get people can do other things outside the wheelchair, just not move as much. But again, it's like, before I lost my leg, I probably used the word lame all the time and didn't really even think about why it might bother me until, I became disabled myself. I think these are all words that, we're just, yeah, it's something I'm also trying to get folks to avoid, but that's another story now.
Oh, wait, you mean just like casually like, oh, that's lame. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no,
Yeah, I think it's just because, I'll be honest, growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s,
I hadn't
I
actually
would
thought
often say
about
that's so gay because that's just the word we all
legitimately
use.
the etymology.
I
of that
consider
word.
myself
Like,
bisexual. I figured out that I was bisexual and I still was using that word, because we pick these things up. But the other point I was going to say is I really can relate to what you're talking about because I think I'm doing the same thing. I'm trying to do more of the same thing as a podcaster. For example, when the first season of Luke Cage came out, me and my regular co-host covered it. And it was, two white cis masculine presenting or it was two white masculine presenting people talking about Luke Cage. And we got some feedback that was like, hey, this isn't really you guys don't really have much to add to this conversation in terms of like you being outsiders to the community the story is really about. And, we thought about that a lot. And in future seasons, I've always tried to make sure there is someone, of a community that can better relate to some of the stories that we comment on. And there's always that danger of like, you don't want to just tokenize that person. And that's one thing I really liked about what you guys did with the Gladys story is because I think one of the things that can happen a lot if you tell stories from people of underserved communities or underrepresented communities is that the only stories you tell are about the reason that they're underrepresented. And what I really loved with the Gladys story is if I remember the first time you introduced her being in a wheelchair didn't even come up. There's so much more to her story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, like it takes like probably like 5-6 pages of like getting her story before it goes into it. And it really is. Yeah, I'm glad that hit because in the review process that was definitely something because like we also wanted it to be like because there's a trope
You can see
in
extra
superhero
good.
stories where someone's disability is actually not a disability, where like Daredevil's blind but he could see, right? And so yeah, like double good. And I feel like that is a trope that always makes me feel like a little weird when we see it in stories, and we didn't want to do that with Gladys because I don't think that. Well, actually, maybe this is better as a question because but my impression is having some form of disability is an inconvenience. Right.
I think that's very true.
It
And
doesn't have to be defined.
And here's also another thing that I know you guys took into account.
Right. And I feel like that nuance is often lost.
No one person you speak to as part of research is going to be able to give you the full range of opinions on that, and within the disability community, like there are some who like to say differently abled instead of disabled. I think that's a little bit silly, but that's a term that some people really like. And some people I think would object to the idea that it's the disability that makes it inconvenient. It's the fact that we live in a world that is built for able-bodied people that creates the inconvenience, and in some cases, like I know, for example, the deaf community doesn't consider themselves part of the disabled community. Some individual deaf people do, but for the most part, they think of that as a separate thing because in them it is a different understanding of communication, not a bad one or a broken one by any means. But I think, the general term there is very true. And I think that one of the things that it is really frustrating, something I talked about a lot and a lot of other disability people have talked about, is that especially for a long time, I think I was really nervous to see a disabled character in either fantasy or science fiction, because so often what would happen is that either the magic or the science would fix that disability, and it would be, I think Daredevil with his blindness is definitely very much one. For me, the scene that broke my heart was Yoda becoming the little bouncing green, ball of lightsabers in Attack of the Clones, because I always related to him. I mean, I was never the most able-bodied kid, but even before I lost my leg, but especially afterwards,
Yeah.
I really related to him
Uh-huh.
as this character who had, his body was not very able. He walked with a cane. He kind of hobbled around, and yet the power of his mind, the power of his spirit, the power of his connection to the Force was incredible. And then to see him just throw away the cane and be able to be this bouncing green ball of fighting, it was a real letdown, because like, oh, I thought I could relate to this character, but now this character is doing something that I could never do in a million years. And so I think seeing the idea that in a superhuman world, disabled people would still exist and still function. And in some cases, they might have power or tech that changes their disability, or some they just might be able to find other ways to use themselves helpfully, would really be great.
It's certainly something we tried with that pitch. Admittedly, we could do more. That story was kind of our take on Oracle, who's my favorite version of Barbara Gordon. It's a continuation of her story. She got shot. She lost the ability to walk. She never lost the ability to fight crime. That was it. And it was a neat way to have somebody in the chair and to continue her story. She was still heroic, and she's cured by science or whatever. As you said, it's simple when you see yourself on screen.
Yeah.
And it's something that if you're a part of, I hesitate to use the term normal, but if you are not disabled, you
able-bodied
certainly
is a good term.
Able-bodied, you're not going to have that experience, or you have it so much that it's no longer special to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the key things in telling that story, and I think that I'm not sure if Jack got that in conversations with people with various disabilities. The real trick was that the Heroic Legion itself was not accessible. Like, it was not an accessible space, and they had this person who is actually ideal to be doing this kind of work, and they just didn't think to use her because, like, and like we're taking like sort of 1980s mentality. They just saw the chair, going in there, and I think those kinds of frustrations, without like we didn't want to be like sappy about it, but just like that very real frustration. It's like there were 4 steps. They could have just put in a freaking ramp and been done, but it's just like they are a superhero organization, and they just weren't thinking about it. And just like watching how that works.
And I think that was the thing I probably liked most about that story, is that, as I said, for like a lot of us, there's this thought of
kind of fun thing that I didn't expect when I first heard the pitch.
Living, using a chair for a lot of my existence is, it has some advantages, it has some disadvantages. But the main problem is that a lot of the world is built in a way where it's sort of assumed, oh yeah, having one step into an entrance is not a problem. Having 4 steps between this part of the house and this part of the house, or this part of the building or this part of the building, it's just not a thing we think about. It's completely invisible to us. And like, I remember there was a venue that I used to love going to for events that I wanted to go to again after I had lost my leg and was now using a wheelchair. And I just totally forgot there were a couple of stairs that went into, I think, used to get to the bathrooms, because I just had never thought about it before. And when you tell the story that way, and it's not about fixing the character, Gladys in this case, it's about fixing the environment around her, because she is superpowered and she can do all these incredible things. It's just that we've put up these dumb barriers that don't need to be there. Yeah. Just to refresh people, do you want to give a quick summary of
just like the minimal amount of stuff for your own benefit?
Story in terms of her powers, and how they realize what she's
bringing these
for?
people in only benefits society as a whole. Yeah, Oh yeah, that would have been a smart thing for us to do when we were talking about it. Yeah, so this is the dispatch for the Heroic Legion, which is our like Avengers or like our
Right.
main heroing organization. You call 911, you have a supervillain on your hands. They patch it over to Gladys, who can multiply herself. And so she is the entire dispatch center. She knows everyone, and she's able to be on the phone
Mhm.
1,000 times at once. She just keeps making copy after copy, and they'll link together.
Yeah, if I remember,
And it's
there's
a
some
story
kind of
about how
crisis
she
where they need someone
basically
who can
got her
like
shot
understand what's happening in
to do
St.
that,
Louis
and
at the
then
same time they know what's happening
is
in
now completely
Washington or that kind of thing. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, the Villainous League puts out a bounty on anyone with the name Jennifer,
I appreciated that.
and
Terrible.
which led to one of my favorite
I
jokes
think
of
bad
the season,
puns
which
are a
is they were
language of
trying
love,
to
so
prevent
I'm
a
with you.
Jenny side, which is so dumb. God. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just want to shout out Amanda Sykes.
That's kind of wonderful.
Who plays Gladys in that
So,
episode, who's also
what about other issues?
the voice
I
of
was obviously
Iron
directly involved in
Barracuda,
the
who's the
disability
head of the
one.
Legion,
Were there
so,
other
she
issues
really only
where
has herself to
you
blame.
guys found that it was important to reach out to others, or where just because you'd written about the topic in the past, you'd done that kind of research? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sir. Well, I mean, a lot of the season is coded for
Mm-hmm.
the gay
Yeah.
and trans movement right now. Certainly, that's our main antagonist is
Mhm.
a version of the alt right, and a lot of the rhetoric that they have.
You're a
around
spy. I'm just gonna call you a spy.
that part was
Yeah.
easy because again, I hang out with those guys
For money.
professionally, not because I like to. Yeah. Um, for America, Jack. But there were a few moments throughout the season where yeah, I have a lot of friends in various parts of the queer community, and there was like just like here and there was just like, hey, as a stand-in, like
Yeah.
how explicit, is this cruel? Is this uplifting? Is this accurate? Is this like
Yeah.
Basically vibe check constantly as we were going through the season. Just to make sure that we were
And also just
conveying the tone that we intended to.
We have at various points of writing this season, and we
was a big
did
one.
a version of this in season 1 where we stacked up all the
Mhm.
male names and all our female names. We're just like, how many characters of consequence are men? And through there was no malice intended. We had just a lot of our more leading roles just so happening to be men. So we changed gender there. And
Yeah, more so in season
definitely
1,
during
but,
season 2, we had kind of a version of, okay, well, how many are
Right.
black? How many are straight, gay, and trying to just cast a wider net for no other
Yeah.
for honestly kind of selfish reasons to just make this show sound different.
Mhm.
And that's an advantage. Just having that diversity means that we're going to cast different people. Like our main
Right.
2 characters this season were 2 Indian American women, and that just
Yeah.
came from the randomness of season 1 of who's the person we're going to focus on. It was Steven Singh, and he became central to season 1, and season 2 became about his daughters. And that it wasn't something we weren't writing the series with our
Right.
lead character is going to be somebody of
yeah, Southeast
well,
Asia
but it's
definitely
just
100%
it
has
was
to.
just random. And because we've tried
Yeah.
to strive to have as diverse a cast as possible, we've continued that into season 2, which is something I'm proud of.
And I think that's such an important thing because as John, you and I were talking a little bit both off air and a little bit on, I think one of the things that can happen is when you bring it, when you start with a position of like, okay, the default character is white cis straight male, which I don't think is like, no one's bad for starting from that position. I'm not saying you guys even were, but just I think that's where most of us start because that's certainly the societal default. The idea then becomes, okay, if we're going to bring in this character, let's tell this story about their issues about this thing. And, I think like Ms. Marvel, for example, is a great show about a Pakistani American. And that show is deeply rooted in the Pakistani and Indian experience of English colonialism and of the separation and all of that. In the case of the Sings, their story has nothing to do with that. It's a story about people who are American and are from the Indian subcontinent. And I don't know, like, I think that nature of who they are might come up once or twice in the story, but the story is fundamentally about, public identity and who claims mantles and stuff like that, and to me, that's, I think, what we need more of is the story. Yeah. Like tell the story about the backgrounds that we don't get to hear the stories of, but also just of those people existing in the world.
Like, yeah, I mean, and I think that's actually really a lot of, I mean, like, one, it helps that we have like a pretty diverse cast that we could fall back to, but I think the idea of just being like, well, why does this have to be a dude? Like, why does this guy like have to be white? For just like our baseline characters really like gave us some interesting casting. I know in season 1, we in both seasons we gender flopped a couple of characters specifically for an actress who gave a really good performance in our table reads. And I think just being open to the idea of like, oh, yeah, duh. There's nothing. Why does this person with the long stretchy arms have to be a dude? Like there's nothing inherently masculine about this feature. And when you're thinking about that, it just applies to all forms of casting. Like there's no absolutely there are stories that are, like you said, like Kamala Khan, rooted in their cultural experience, but otherwise it's like roll a d20.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite examples of that is the character who I, at this point, with all due respect to Gladys, but think of as like the absolute pinnacle of disability representation I've seen on screen, which is Echo in the MCU and then with her own show. And that, as I understand it, they wanted a Native woman who was deaf because that's who the character was. And it turned out that the best person in the auditioning process also happened to have a prosthetic leg. And so they said, okay, sure. Like they wrote the character to be Native and to be deaf. They didn't write the character to be an amputee, but they then made that part of the story. And some of it was subtle ways, and some of it was not to spoil anything, but there's one plot point that involves damage to her leg and her getting to fix it in ways that felt incredibly relatable to a lot of us in the prosthetic using community. In a way that, for example, like Misty Knight losing her arm in Iron Fist, and then just Danny Rand buying her this incredibly awesome prosthetic arm that she can put on the next day because somehow swelling heals far faster in that world than our own, didn't speak to us. And it sounds like the exact same thing there. Like, yeah, you can intentionally write characters, but then also when casting, you can say, oh, I'm going to open this up, and if the actor I get is of a different background than I had for this character, then yeah, I'll just change that.
Yeah, best one up. Yeah. I'm just a lot of my thoughts are occupied with like what we're going to do in season 3 too, and
he doesn't want to spoil anything.
I don't want to get too spoilery. Spoiler. I don't want to. Thank you.
That's fair.
Gosh.
I mean, I think we've had a good discussion on this.
I just looked at it.
One thing I want to bring up, I'm curious if you know, have you guys seen the movie American Fiction?
Or read
no, I've seen the trailer.
And American Fiction is definitely, it's like in the next 5 movies I'll watch when I get.
I think it's correct. Yeah. Well, Well, it's very good. I'm not going to spoil anything beyond what's on the book cover kind of thing, but one of the aspects of it is, it's about an author who wants to write Black stories that aren't just, people in the ghetto dealing drugs and speaking the language that is spoken by some members of that community, but also is very much not, sort of universal to Black experience. And half of the movie is just about his kind of upper middle class Black family dealing with the kind of issues that happen in families and movies a lot. And I've heard from a lot of people who are like, well, it didn't make sense to have this parody of the American publishing institution and racism while also having these stories. And I think they really missed the point, because the point in it is that they're both parodying the kind of stories that the media likes to focus on, while also literally telling the kind of stories that it doesn't want to focus on. And I think that's, to me, very similar kind of what you're talking about with, Stephen Singh and his daughters and other things like that, of you can take these characters and tell the stories that are, that people think of when they think of those characters, and often tell them with a better perspective, especially depending on who's in your writing room. But you also could just say, remember, these are just part of our community. And so they're going to have whatever experiences anyone else has.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's it's a balancing act, because it's one of those things too that's like, I think that if you are just open in terms of who you invite into your writing room and who you like have audition, and if you cast a wide enough net, I think it's almost healthier not to go into it with that like full intent, like unless you're planning on telling a story that is rooted in a cultural experience. And I think then it is better to have someone specifically in the writing room there to shape the story. But like, unless you're doing something like that, I think it's just sort of healthy not to like even like think it, like tell the story first, like just think of a human being internally, like what's going on inside it, and tell the story like through their eyes, and then sort of like let the bones fall afterwards. Because it's also easy to like fall into that trap of just being like, we are going to like tell a diverse story, and then
tough.
it's just like
there's
weird.
There's a character
it feels like it's a bunch of check boxes without actually really telling a story.
Recently, and it's John Kent, who's the young Superman, and he's bisexual, and it was a choice by the writer to write him that way. And I remember when I first heard that, admittedly, I was kind of like, why is he bi? And it was a knee-jerk reaction, which honestly came from a selfish place of just like, why isn't he another straight dude? Blah. But then realizing it was this choice that was made that is an opportunity for more story of, well, now you have Clark, who has somebody who's different from himself and that he has to relate to. And now that relates him, that relates to his relationship to his father. And it's just this tiny choice that really doesn't matter in the long run, but means a lot to a wider community in that moment. And then later on, as that story goes on, just grows into larger and larger things. So when we're writing these stories, if we make these choices of, okay, this character is gay, or this character is Black, or this character is a straight white dude, it's just, okay, where's this going to pay off?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've always been much more of a Batman person than a Superman, in part because I always found there was nothing about Superman that I could relate to. He was just too good, too much of the big blue Boy Scout. And yet a teenage boy who's bisexual and is having trouble talking to his father about that, that's a story I can very much relate to. And to me, one of the real powers of that is that if you give me a point of connection with a character, I don't have to be the same as the character. In fact, I want it to be different, because then I can also see how is the experience that we both share actually different from their experience because of their differences. To go back to the Echo example, in terms of my disability, that character I found representation in more so than probably any other character I've seen on screen. But of course, I'm not female, I'm not deaf, I'm not native. And so seeing the experience that I really relate to, but also through these all these other lenses that I don't share, was, I think, great for everybody else. But for me, I mean, very selfishly, I felt like I got a new perspective on my own, existence as an amputee, seeing that same experience through a very different lens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's also like the experience, being able to have these different voices and like, kids who are just like, hey, that's me. And like feeling inspired by that is great. But I think for all audiences, it gets so dull hearing the same story over and over again. And I think I've been watching a lot of K-dramas lately. And and I am just like constantly struck that just like going outside the cultural norms of like making a thing. Because one thing in K-dramas is they do not stick to a genre. Like they'll do things that to an American audience like just is a strong tonal shift. Just because it's like it feels right in the character. Like they'll be like, we're joking around and you have a crush and it's just a silly thing and we're gonna be a rom-com for 3 scenes and then I'm gonna kill your grandparents. I love it. Like, and it brings sparks to my brain when I see stuff like that. I remember. Do you see Sorry to Bother You?
No, I haven't.
To catch people up,
really good story that I could never have.
This was Boots Riley's first movie, and it's about
it's
a young black man who finds work as a helpline person, but he's using he code switches to using a white voice, and the voice he uses is David Cross.
It's a call center.
And it turns out everybody else that works at this place are people of color, and they're selling stuff. It's such a difficult movie to describe. It's like Keith Stanfield, and David Cross is his voice when he's on the phone, but it goes to such like a trippy like mind just exploding place, and oh my god, and again it's just like, yes, new stories, give it to me. Like we're somewhere I haven't been. That's why we make movies and TV and books. It's to take you to places you haven't been. A book that only tells you about your own lived experience is called a diary.
Yeah. I mean, this is a little more grounded, but still felt like I was on the moon. The movie Anatomy of a Fall, which is, among other things, a great murder mystery, but it's also a large part a courtroom drama. But of course, it's set in a court in France. And so anybody who's watched, some episodes of Law and Order, who's just used to, the rhythm of American courtrooms, both my lawyer parents would say that those are not accurate, but still, to that idea, watching a legal drama in the French legal system, where, the judge is kind of a lot the lawyer for both sides, and there's also just all sorts of back and forth instead of just questioning a witness. It was wild. And just for that alone, just to kind of think of like, what are the things that we take for granted as Americans, if you are American and listening to this, but wherever you are, what are the things you take for granted about your own country's legal system? Because you've seen it in legal dramas, and now getting to see it through a completely different lens. Or like I remember they did Law and Order London for a season, and every time the cops would arrest them, they wouldn't read them their rights, which was so baffling to me because that's not a thing in England. That's a specific rule we have in the United States.
Though, something you said is also, I think, an interesting mindset, because I think
just
Americans
yet,
tend to
Max.
Forget that other people aren't Americans. And I think that is an interesting trope.
We tend to universalize. I said other people would do this, but probably it's mostly Americans who universalize their experience that much.
Well, I mean, as an American, I assume everyone does it.
Yeah. Well played, sir. Well played. This has been great. I'm sure I'm going to have you guys on again when season 3 comes, or any other excuse we can. Any other last things you just want to say about these questions we've been talking about before we wrap up? We will have a bonus section talking about some of the other things that both of these wonderfully creative fellows are working on. But any of the last things you want to say about
Damn, I
SPR
was counting on you
and
going
representation and writing and disability and all the rest?
It just comes down to
Here, checking.
just take a chance. I'll admit that when I hear about something being done with my beloved Marvel or DC characters and it's something new, it just by virtue of it being new, I'm kind of going, why? Like, why is this writer doing this? Like, it was better when it was better the way I knew it when I was 13. And if you give it a chance and read it, you'll most likely be surprised. It's probably going to be something that's going to grab your attention. And with your own work, and especially if you're working in a collaborative medium, if you're looking at people to work with, try somebody new. A lot of the writers that we brought on are folks that I met over the phone or via email, and I'm just it was here's their pitch. Let's read it. Let's kick it around. And there were a couple people in there that I wasn't even 100% sure on, but it was just, let's give them a chance. And it just wholesale, I was surprised by everybody. And it's just that if you give people a chance to do something cool, I'm going to go ahead and say that 95% of the time they're going to turn something in pretty gosh dang cool. 4% of the time turn into something that's okay, and 1% it'll be bad, so
yeah. I think it's so true because I've had that exact same experience of like, why are they changing the thing I love?
He's the best.
And I remember having it especially about Robert Pattinson as Batman. I was like, why is the vampire guy in my favorite story? And of course, I think that his performance is one of the best. But what's funny to me is, I think I'm about 10 years older than both of you, so you may not remember this, or you may. The people who like the folks who are like, oh yeah, he shouldn't have been Batman. This person should have been Batman. They always look to Michael Keaton. When Michael Keaton was cast as Batman, comic book folks went nuts. We didn't have the internet, so it wasn't like as easily findable. But Michael Keaton to that point was kind of the aw shucks, I'm tripping over myself, but I'm cute and charming romantic hero of rom-coms and TV shows. He'd never played anything heroic or physical. And people thought this was ridiculous to have this guy play Batman. And of course, now he's like considered one of the definitive ones. So yeah, I think it's always such a good idea of, think about the things that, you love and are dear to you, and maybe this change, and sometimes the change will not be what you want, and that's okay. There are, God, why can't Ben Affleck is just never going to be my Batman, and that's fine. But sometimes things will surprise you.
Yeah, and so for me, I think I have kind of a weird perspective because I spend so much time in these alt-right spaces where they are angry about anything to do with diversity. Currently, they're still blaming the DEI programs at Boeing for plane malfunctions. Which I got to talk to an expert in the aircraft industry who pointed out that Boeing is actually less diverse today than they were when they started DEI programs. They are more white than ever right now. And and of course it's also nothing to do with DEI, even if that weren't the case, because it's just finance bros coming in and destroying industries. Anyways, leftist politics aside, speaking to a lot of these people, like, because these people are legitimately upset every time there's a black Ariel, for instance, and they're like, like these are people who are unironically chanting like, you're ruining my childhood. And I think that, it's easy to forget that until Black Panther, studio execs legitimately were like, we can't have a minority superhero on the poster. No one will see the movie. That's 2018.
Yeah.
right? And so like, you know, just the act of like, you know, and there is such a stupid like corporate ethos to a lot of like diverse casting in like blockbusters, but for just everyday stories, just normalizing it is so freaking important, because until it's something
really
that
is.
you don't have to think about anymore, there's always going to be people who are like, the default is white, the default is guy, right? Like the default is
Right.
straight. And if you're telling any other kind of story, you are on some sort of like political mission. And I feel like,
Right. You're woke.
yeah, it's this woke thing. And I feel like the only way you really combat that is with volume. I feel like you just have to like, because right now, I mean, like you have a Miles Morales movie, like no one's being like, oh geez, like Into the Spider-Verse. I don't know, it sounds kind of risky, you dudes. And that was lessened because we had Black Panther before it, but it's still, people still have that conversation. Like stupid Nepo babies who run studios still had that conversation. And so, you know, the only answer is to do it more. You know, if you're telling a story and it doesn't have and it has too many white characters, consider just mixing it up, if only to piss off white supremacists.
I do want to have you on my Star Wars podcast at some point, just to hear you talk about how there's so much Star Wars content coming with Black Jedi. So that would be a great topic to get you on to discuss. But I think, yeah, it's such a good point. And to me, I remember I went to a con that was all about kind of supernatural and comic books and stuff like that. And there was a panel of all Black creators talking about how important it was to them that Luke Cage and Black Panther came out about the same time, because Luke Cage was about a lot of the stories that are often told already, but being told in a much different way, you know, from the Black experience, instead of being told just, you know, white guys writing about, you know, what they think Black people in poor neighborhoods are like. And it was so diverse, and there were so many different experiences even within that community. But then also Black Panther comes out, which is all about Afrofuturism. It has nothing to do with that kind of thing. And, you know, I would say, you know, and my closing thing would just be my pitch to you is help round out Gladys's story by giving us someone who is in a wheelchair or has some other disability, but still does have some great combat fighting ability. You know, I'd love to hear someone call, what's your car talk version of utility belt? Yeah. I'd love to hear someone who has, like, you know, is paraplegic, but has this incredible Iron Man type suit that they control with their brain, and they come in with problems like that, or just, you know, anything like that, just to be able to say, yeah, we told this version of the story, but here's all these other ways that the characters can come around too.
Yeah, that's I'm definitely open to it. But, you know, the idea that like the way that we really elevate a class is by making them a cop. Sorry,
you're in good company here.
What happened is we opened the lid on my progressive politics, and now all of a sudden,
well, see, you assumed I meant a hero.
Yeah,
I mean, like, there's the whole idea of like, you know, I support women's rights, but I also support women's wrongs. Give me a disabled supervillain.
Yeah,
like that'd be badass as hell. You know.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. I'll ask you a question that I very unfortunately forgot to ask the first time. How do people find Superhuman Public Radio and the wealth of social media you guys do around it? Because there's a lot of it.
Yeah, well, it's at SPR Pod, or you could just type into whatever podcast app you use, or the googly, you know, Superhuman Public Radio.
It's beautiful.
Not superhero,
Max.
Superhuman Public Radio. It's yours. Yeah. Human stories, but super.
I like it. Thank you. It's a fantastic podcast. Definitely check it out. Please follow us with all the other great stuff that these two do. That'll be in the show notes. We're going to talk about it more in the member section, which, by the way, is a great time to say, for only $5 a month, $55 a year, you can become a member. It's a way to help support the podcast and what we do. Like I said, I got a new computer that I need to buy and some new microphones, and every dollar helps. But more importantly, you get bonus content. You get full bonus episodes. We've been doing the book club over on the Star Wars podcast. We hope to start doing something soon, like that on superhero ethics. And you just get a great way to help support what we're doing. So on behalf of myself and these creators, thank you all so much. We have spoken.